This FedGov Today program is sponsored by Maximus. On this edition of FedGov Today with Francis Rose, financial management moves to get the most out of your agency's budget, the business collaboration model that'll move the contracting needle, and building back the government-vendor relationship. Welcome to FedGov Today with Francis Rose. The White House says the Pentagon and the Office of Management and Budget can reprogram whatever money they need to pay troops while the government is shut down. Politico reports the agency should use, quote, any funds left over from fiscal year 2025. Danny Werfel is executive in residence at the Johns Hopkins School of Government and Public Policy. He's former commissioner of the IRS and former controller at OMB. Danny, welcome. Thanks for joining me. It's great to have you here. What resources do financial managers have to move money around, and what's really an explicit no-no during a shutdown?
Well, there's not a lot. Once the appropriations lapse, you're really constrained from what we call creating new budget authority, assuming that you have new money to use. So no new obligations for contracts or grants. But there are sources of money that you can spend, and there's a couple of examples, like prior year money or multi-year money, or what's sometimes called no-year money, where it's not tied to this year's appropriation. You can also use fee-funded activities. There are these things called franchise funds, which again are funded not dependent on congressional appropriations, but other government receipts. And then there's reprogramming. You can, in certain situations, take money from one account to another to fund an activity, but there's a lot of limits on that. It's not open-ended, and so there's a lot of law and analysis that needs to go into whether you're going to reprogram or not. At OMB, when I was there and we were running Shutdown, we certainly allowed reprogramming, but not creative reprogramming.
What's the difference between allowable reprogramming and creative reprogramming, in your view?
First of all, there needs to be a legal basis and authority that exists for the programming. So you start, that's prong one. And prong two is really that it's used for the same purpose, right? So if you have money that was originally programmed for technology or technology infrastructure, and now you want to use it for payroll, you may not be able to, because the original law that authorized and appropriated those funds, even if they're from last year or they're multi-year funds, were for one purpose. And when you use it for a cross purpose, then you get into a potential Anti-Deficiency Act violation. And so it's incumbent upon OMB to establish the parameters for when you can and can't reprogram.
So you touched on a word there that might be the most important one of all, and that is authorization. A lot of people lose sight of the fact that all federal money is both authorized and appropriated, and I think during a shutdown, a lot of people focus on the appropriations part and not so much on the authorization part.
Yeah, and those laws, it's like the one grabs the baton from the other, establish the parameters for how long you can spend the money for, how much you can spend, and what you can spend it on. And so when you're in a shutdown, it becomes even more constrained in terms of the degrees of freedom. And a lot of it, it's just a complete no-fly zone. You're not allowed to spend it at all. And that's why you see government operations suspended in so many different places during a shutdown. The other really interesting thing about a shutdown is that it evolves. Our agencies across government have their shutdown plans. And your shutdown plan lays out what you're going to keep open and what you're going to keep closed. And there's this whole part of what you keep open because there might be a threat or risk to life or property. And so you exempt those activities and keep them open. But that shifts over time. What might not be a risk on day one of the shutdown might become a risk on day 20 of the shutdown. And so there's an expectation also that not a lot of people realize is that these shutdown plans can be fluid. And so there's so much complexity. Can I reprogram for a different purpose? Generally, no. But can I update my shutdown plan as the environment changes and risks change? Yes.
Did you find when you were running the shutdown 2013 that risk framework changed during the shutdown, that you had to alter those shutdown plans as they evolved?
I was actually IRS commissioner at the time, so we were running the operation, and we had about 2/3 of the agency furloughed, but we had a responsibility to preserve against cyber threats. We had to preserve remittances and other things. And as the days unfolded, we were shifting who was furloughed and who wasn't around this idea of we have to protect life or property, including government property. And so these things do evolve. Shutdowns are messy. They should always be avoided. That's my first wish and hope, is that we don't ever get to a shutdown. It wasn't intended. It's not the way you would design the railroad to be run.
Yeah.
And so you have all of these gray areas. Can these funds be reprogrammed for this purpose? How does your shutdown plan evolve? All of it is in a gray area, and hopefully what happens is the Government Accountability Office will come in after each shutdown and evaluate whether, certain rules were bent too far or not, and hopefully we can get smarter and smarter about future shutdowns. But if we're up to me, no shutdowns.
No shutdowns ever again. You mentioned 3 kinds of money: prior year money, multi-year money, and no-year money. Do all agencies have those to consider, or are those peculiar to certain types of missions or certain types of organizations?
It's peculiar, and it's peculiar within organizations, but it's prior year money. We had leftover and we were allowed to roll it over because it was authorized for multiple year use. So I don't have to spend it all by the end of the fiscal year. You also have these working capital funds where, for example, at GSA, they're collecting rent receipts from all the federal agencies each year, and they can reuse that money. They don't have to go back to Congress to get money appropriated. So if there's extra money in the working capital fund at GSA, they can use it even during a shutdown, but they can't use it for any purpose. So if the purpose of that money is to maintain federal facilities, great, you can use it for that purpose. But you then might not be able to go buy laptops with it because that's a different purpose. And that goes back to this question that I think many people will have as the current administration starts to repurpose money for different uses. Have they colored within the right lines? And again, there's so much gray area. We don't know the actual answer. Maybe the courts could decide. Who knows? My reliance typically is on the Government Accountability Office to come in after the fact and do a vetting and hopefully get everyone smarter about what the right lines are to color and color outside of.
It's great to have you on the show as always, Danny.
Always
Thank
good
you
to
very
be
much.
here.
You can read more about financial management during the shutdown on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, the business collaboration model that'll move the contracting needle. FedGov Today with Francis Rose continues in a moment.
That needs to be the focus, where we can leverage AI, where we can bring in AI to look at analytics and supporting analytics in a more robust method and manner than we do today. There are a lot of different things from a technology standpoint that I think once we get the opinion, we'll be able to invest more heavily into that and focus on that. I think another thing that we need to really strongly consider is looking at the Rolodex of policies, procedures, regulations. I think we could pour some acid on some of those documents and see what we need and what fits in an environment of today versus what we were living in the legacy environment.
See what survives after a little bit of a testing by fire. Welcome back. Federal agency leaders say they'll incorporate more artificial intelligence solutions into their business processes. The Trump administration's also pressing agencies to use more commercial solutions to improve operations. Ron Leidner is Vice President of Client Engagement at Maximus. He's former senior advisor at the IRS. Ron, welcome. Thanks for joining me. What's the most important thing that you see for agencies to build back all the collaborative relationships that they're building with industry, internally, and so on?
There's so many facets to this. It's interesting. You mentioned AI in the intro. One of the things right now to build back confidence is you've got to have BI, business intelligence, before you start to implement artificial intelligence. Folks right now in the government are challenged. The administration has said, we'd like you to go ahead and implement AI as soon as possible. But you've got to have a business reason first for why you're going to do it. Otherwise, it just becomes a bright and shiny thing that you put in place and people are using it. It's like, but there's no value to it. There's nothing there for the constituency or the taxpayers. And so a key thing to build this back is a business-led collaborative solutioning model where the business and the IT organizations, in any federal agency get together and they say, let's talk about an outcome that we seek. What's the value, the business value proposition in a business case that allows us to deliver value? And so when you build that collaborative framework, it gets accountability and responsibility for both areas to succeed. Mm-hmm. Something that's been, as you know, it's been mostly IT's funded. So IT's funded to do a certain thing, mm-hmm. and the business customers pretty much like, we're going to trust our IT partners to do it. But in the environment we're in right now, to deliver solutions with velocity to meet these needs and to propel us into AI, we've got to have those collaborative relationships.
How much of that responsibility is on the business side and how much is on the IT side to say, we need to continue to work together, you can't throw this over the wall, even though we're paying for it technically on the IT side?
I think it's a shared responsibility, but I think it's a shared responsibility with 100% accountability of both areas. And so the IT organization, in many cases, owns the budget. It's like, it's our money and we're going to deploy it the way that we need to. But when you get value out of it, when you can say, as an example, we're going to eliminate fraud or we're going to reduce fraud within a particular part of, say, the IRS, for example, we're going to do that. So you say, what percentage of fraud? And are you looking to automate your business processes to do it, to make it better for the people actually doing the work and better for the taxpayers that are receiving the service? And so it's a shared responsibility with 100% accountability. And that model is something that needs to be introduced right now, particularly with what we're going through right now with the shutdown and, and layoffs that are occurring and things along those lines.
Are the risks to an organization in the same on the business side and on the IT side, or does the risk framework look different? And does it look different depending on the organization, mission, so on?
I think it looks different depending on the organization. This is a relatively new model, and so folks are gonna have to kind of try it on a little bit before it really takes effect. But I think it varies by agency. I know that if you're only deploying an IT solution, if you have to replace a server, that's pretty much the IT organization is going to own that and take care of it. Mm-hmm. But if you're replacing the server because you've got a level of service that you're trying to take care of for a constituency, you've got to have the business process that goes along with replacing the server. So it really depends on the instance and what you're going to be doing with it by agency.
It strikes me, too, there's a terrific opportunity here to completely revisit business processes during these modernization efforts. Are agencies, is it your sense, leveraging that full opportunity to its greatest potential?
I think right now, in the current environment, and it's been fairly frenetic over the last 6 months, right now folks are still trying to find ground. And so the opportunity that's here is, if you're going to be transforming, and I on purpose didn't use the word modernization, if you're transforming legacy systems, the right way to go about doing that, in my mind, is to get with the business to say, if we're transforming it, let's make sure that we're building a workflow or we're meeting your needs, to get there. Right now, it's pretty much like, we're just going to keep the lights on and build the legacy system and, pretty much patch the holes in it. So the opportunity is there. It's going to require a shift of thinking and an absolute shift in being able to take the risk to do that.
It sounds like there's a risk to just doing it the way that you just described it, though, and missing out on that opportunity to transform a process or a system.
100%. And as you know, the administration right now is really after, let's make sure we can make things most efficient and get things deployed as quickly as we can with velocity. And so the other challenge is, in government, in my experience, it's things have been big bang. It's like we have a big bang thing that we have to do in 3 years. And generally speaking, it is a big bang because we go 3 years and you find out that the relationship between the business and IT has eroded and the business doesn't get what they expected. When you deliver with velocity, you lay out the whole thing and then say, incrementally, how can we provide value for the business as we go along? So you build as you go. You see increases in performance and improvement and transformation and automation as you go through. As you get to your 3-year mark, you're saying, I've achieved everything I needed to achieve.
Ron, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks for joining me
Thank
today.
you.
You can read more about the business IT connection at agencies on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, building back the government-vendor relationship. FedGov Today with Francis Rose continues in a moment.
The grants community is woefully underserved by their existing grants management systems and grants technologies. And it's really handicapped us in general. So we put out the Grants Accelerator in 2020. We worked with Microsoft to identify the right mix of technologies to streamline a system that we can stand up quickly in the event of a disaster or an emergency, COVID being a great first example of that. And that is super flexible, can be used in a wide variety of grants management scenarios, and even, by the way, non-grant scenarios. So there are a lot of funding mechanisms that are, I would call them grants adjacent, things like benefits and assistance or even claims programs. And we've used EYGA, that's our shorthand, across the gamut of those types of projects. And really what it gives us and what it gives our grant makers who use it is the flexibility to try new things. So not to just put out different kinds of money, but to try putting it out in different ways and see how the results change. To aggregate that data into one place so that they can see the impact of that. To have a secure, safe location that respects the trust that grant recipients and members of the community place in all of us to safeguard their data appropriately.
First, when it comes to open source intelligence, the first immediate risk is to be synthetic media. This is generative AI or automated narrative signals that can change and move crowds within hours, right? And second, you have state and criminal convergence, which cyber actors, syndicates, cartels are blending information operations, revenue, and attempting to change sentiment and adhere to sympathy for adversarial reasons. And then supply chain and infrastructure risks. We see changes in supply chain from energy to sub-based chemicals like polyurethane. And this is where, if you utilize open source intelligence, you find the earliest warning signals for these particular issues, multilingual, of course.
Welcome back. Contractor groups are already warning of the impact the shutdown will have on the contracting base. Those groups remind Congress that dozens of companies lost workers and even went out of business after the 2019 shutdown. Soraya Correa is president and CEO of National Industries for the Blind. She's former chief procurement officer at the Department of Homeland Security. Soraya, welcome. Thanks for joining me. You were at DHS during the 2013 shutdown. What's your callback to what you saw happen in the aftermath of that shutdown when you went back to the agency and when you started reaching out to your vendors to kind of get everything back on track?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. Certainly there was an impact to the workforce out there, the vendor community, as well as in the government, believe it or not, because some of the newer employees that came in, if they're living paycheck to paycheck, they can't afford to lose a paycheck, and so some of them left government. Similarly with industry, if you're not working, industry can only carry people for so long. Some organizations might have administrative funds that they might be able to charge to, but over time they are going to lose people, and people are going to go work in other locations. We did see an impact. The good news is essential employees, of course, are working. They're working without a check. Those are easier to keep, but regular businesses, especially small businesses, tend to be impacted pretty heavily during a shutdown.
And the impact of that resulted in what to the agency and could potentially this time result in what to the agency?
Generally speaking, what you're going to see are delays in the work, because when the contractor comes back, they got to staff up again, they got to get people on board, you got to get those people cleared, got to get them trained if they're not already trained in the work. So generally speaking, it's what you're going to see is a slowdown in the work, right? Which in a way might be good, because the government folks are coming back and trying to catch up just where they left off and what's been piling on their desk. Because interestingly enough, even though you're on a furlough, there's still work ongoing. When you talk about essential work, you're focused on the things that have to get done. The routine and recurring is piling up.
You were in an organization that has such a wide variety of missions, mission sets, the types of people that stay, folks that were exempted, folks that weren't exempted. What does that mean for somebody that's coming back to a little bit of everything as far as managing through the reopening process?
So from a leader's perspective, the first thing you got to do is reorient your staff. You got to bring your team together. Morale's already going to be shot because you've been on a shutdown. So you got to bring your team together and kind of rebuild that morale, energize them again, and tell them what the priorities are. It's really important that from a leadership perspective, you lay down what are the priorities, what do we need to focus on, what are the big rocks that we have to move, so to speak. And then the other thing I would also say is, from an employee standpoint, you need to immediately start reaching out to your vendors, because as you start to lift stop work orders, you got to notify your vendors so that they can come back, give you their proposal for any delays they encounter, any additional costs, et cetera, and how they're going to get started back up. So there's a lot of work to be done. I would say the most important thing is you got to be patient with yourself, right? Because you're not going to solve all the problems at once. You got to maintain good communications. This is where your network, your work network, is extremely important. As a chief procurement officer at DHS, one of the people that I relied on very, very heavily was my chief financial officer, of course my general counsel to make sure that we didn't do anything crazy, but also my CIO. Because the other thing you got to think about is systems. Are there updates to the networks? What has to happen next? So you got to sit down and kind of plan it out, meet with that leadership team, and then flow that down to your staff. The most important thing that I always try to tell leaders is stay in tune with your staff as they're coming back, because they're already hurt. You know, it's painful. It is painful when you go through a shutdown, and so you want to maintain constant communications, make sure they understand what are priorities, make sure they're well informed of what's going on, and if you don't know the answer to a question, just say, I don't know, I will go out and find out for you.
What I think is most striking to me as I'm connecting what you're saying to what I talked to folks about in the wake of the 2019 shutdown is the folks that got back up to speed the fastest were the folks that didn't focus on process and procedure. They were the people that focused on the stuff that you just talked about, which is, where's my workforce? What are they thinking about? How are they doing? And how can I help them get back up to speed as quickly as possible?
And what are my priorities? Yeah. You got to prioritize the work. In other words, you can't do everything at once. So you got to sit down and think about it and prioritize. What are we going to work on first? What are the things that we really got to take care of right away? And how do we deal with that backlog, right? Because you're going to still have a backlog of work. How are we going to address that? But the most important thing is talk to your people, talk to your people, talk to your people. You will always hear me say that, because I think it's extremely important that you maintain that communications. And even during the shutdown, people are listening to the news and, you know, they're hearing all kinds of stuff. I think it's really important when you can to keep people informed. You know, you can put out informational messages that say, here's what's going on, here's what's happening, here's what's not happening. Because there is a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of speculation, and I think it's important for employees to be kept informed.
When you talk about establishing priorities, I imagine that in the wake of something like this is rather fluid also, because you might find the thing that you want to do first, that vendor's not ready to help you yet. Is that a fair observation?
That's a fair observation. Usually when I'm referring to the priorities, is the priorities of the agency. What is the most important thing to start up? Because you've issued stop work orders on contracts, so you have to think about what are the contracts that I really need to start up right away, because remember, you're not going to have funds flowing on day one. That's not the way it works. So you have to think about what are the things that have to be funded first, what's important to our secretary, to the administration, and then also what can vendors do. You're going to have a great deal of patience talking to vendors, because they too have to do some planning. They have to think about how are they going to shift resources around. One of the things that I've always found about the vendor community, they are focused on mission just as we are. And so they're going to think about, where can I move resources around to better support you to get started back up. So it's extremely important that that line of communication is just so important and so vital.
Final thought, what did you do after the 2013 shutdown that you think set you up for the most amount of success or helped you get back to normal as quickly as possible, Soraya?
So I think the most important thing that I did, of course, like I said, prioritize, communicate, but then I also documented lessons learned. I said, let's think about it now while it's fresh in our heads. As we're doing all this work, let's take some time to think about what didn't we do that we should have done? What did we do that we probably didn't need to do? And what are the things that, if I could do it over again, how would I do it differently? I think it's extremely important to take a little bit of time to do lessons learned. I can't tell you the value of that. And also, believe it or not, it also helps you kind of relieve some of the stress of the shutdown, because you get an opportunity to kind of whine and get it out of the way, but really document what you learned so that the next time you're better prepared. Just a quick comment. Since 1996, we've been dealing with, CRs, and we've had, 3 major shutdowns. I think it's 3 major shutdowns. And we've had little shutdowns. I think it's important to understand this is almost becoming a way of life. I hate to say that, but it is. So let's make sure that we continue to learn from it, document those lessons so that each one is a little bit smoother, a little bit easier to take. Although they are never easy, it's a painful process.
Soraya, it's always great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You can read more about contractors and acquisition during the shutdown and after on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. FedGov Today continues in just a moment.
We're really focused on non-kinetic effects, and specifically cyber, electronic warfare, and information operations. And I think General Barrett said it well last night in her keynote that this is about bringing non-kinetic effects up to the level of reliability and predictability that commanders have in kinetic effects. A commander wants to be able to dictate, I want that effect to have that impact at that destination at that point in time, and have the outcomes be as predictable as a kinetic effect. I think to do that, one of the things we absolutely need to enable is that connective tissue of data, between those 3 different areas, right, as well as across security levels with cross-domain solutions.
You see all of this going? What's the trajectory on which you see the innovation community in both government and industry escalating and scaling?
Well, if you look at something like, again, it all comes back to a problem statement. So we need the problem statement in order to innovate sometimes. And, in industry, it's different because you're doing it in the corporate side without the federal government behind you in order to meet your bottom line. But from a federal government perspective, you need a problem statement, like put a man on the moon again, and then everyone can rally around that. And so, and I don't want to keep going back to the problem statement, but that's often what you need in order to innovate and make sure that it happens.
FedGov Today TV returns next Sunday morning at 10:30. I'm Francis Rose. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Have a great week.